So it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Meira Goldberg, who is based at the Fashion Institute of Technology in New York, and is a scholar in residence at the Foundation of Iberian Music at the City University of New York. Professor Goldberg is a flamenco performer, choreographer, teacher, and scholar. In 1980s Madrid, she performed nightly in flamenco tablaos alongside artists such as Antonio Canales, Arturo Pavón, El Indio Gitano, and Diego Carrasco. In the US, she was first dancer with Carlos Santana, Fred Moten, and Passioni Arte. She's instigated and collaborated on various book projects, including 100 Years of Flamenco in NYC, Flamenco on the Global Stage, the global reach of the fandango in music, song, and dance, and transatlantic malagueñas and zapateados in music, song, and dance. And forthcoming projects include the collaboration Flamenco History, Performance and Culture, and the Body Questions, celebrating flamenco's tangled roots. And she's also working on a monograph from which this presentation comes, called Perra Mora, Love and War in the Body of a Woman. Her monograph Sonidos Negros on the blackness of flamenco, which is a favorite of mine, published by Oxford University Press, won the Barnard Hewitt Award for the best 2019 book in theatre history, as well as an honourable mention for the Sally Baines Publication Award. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to pass over to Professor Goldberg. Thanks ever so much.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm really happy to see you all. I'm going to share my screen and get right to it. And we'll have time for questions at the end. So thank you, Matthew, Machin. Thank you to the University of Aberdeen and to the University of Cambridge. Thank you to all the distinguished scholars who are part of this project, Samuel Llano, for including me in this wonderful series. Your conversations on the past and present musical encounters across the Strait of Gibraltar are so important at many levels, and I'm really honored to be with you today. The research I'm sharing, as Matthew just said, is from a new book project called Love and War, Perra Mora, Love and War in the Body of a Woman, which is on the Moresque Morris performance complex, which I am framing as a European representation of Moorishness. And this image is from Valdeomar's 1961 film, Fuego en Castilla. The Perra Mora, or Moorish Bitch, is a Spanish Renaissance dance song, a zarabanda, first recorded in the Cancionero Medinaceli of circa 1560. I am studying the legacy of medieval Iberia's multilingual, multicultural, and multiconfessional society in what I am arguing is an ancestor of flamenco dance. The Perra Mora, I argue, is a stepping stone in the representation of race, at the same time that it retains and transmits elements of Islamicate performance into the European canon. Methodologically, I want to address the question of how practice-based knowledge fits and can be integrated into our study of history. Medieval and early modern dance was always transmitted orally and is only recorded in the most rudimentary fashion, even in the elite contexts in which it is recorded at all. I am arguing that embodied flamenco knowledge is a rich repository of non-white and non-elite practices, just the sort of cultural practices that are rarely documented in the written and iconographic Western canon. Aside from instruments such as the lute, the bowed strings instruments that will become the viol family, and the guitar, aside from the melodies that scholars think may have accompanied those instruments, aside from the virtuosic improvisational melisma that characterized the music performed in Muslim Iberian courts, the varying expressive registers of the voice, and I'm citing here Owen Wright, Manuela Cortés Garcia, and Dwight Reynolds. Aside from the techniques unique to Al-Andalus of singing from the chest, the throat, the forehead or sinuses, and the head, there is another element of Andalusi music, which many scholars think was influential throughout Western Europe, and which is undoubtedly important in Spanish music, and especially flamenco, and that is lyric poetry. While few traces of medieval dance survive and no notated music from Islamic Iberia survives, hundreds of poems do survive from both Muslim and Christian courts. And in the 13th century cantigas that were written at Alfonso X's court, we have an image here of one of those. We have music for many of these verses. The medieval Iberian songbook has been exhaustively studied, and it is these lyrics, which we know were sung in dance, that I am proposing as a source of information on dance. Flamenco performance is a commercialized spectacle, but its language is that of communal ritual. Flamenco practice centers around the singer and the repertoire that she or he interprets, passed down from generation to generation within specific communities, and flamenco lyrics are important markers of identity. The flamenco singer must essay a soaring and improvisational vocal journey, must pelear con el cante, or fight with the song, a high-stakes sortie, which entails wresting an ancient song into the vivid present. Embroidering a melodic line with modulations ranging from whispers to shouts to coughs to sobs. Keeping to complex rules of rhyme, rhythm, melody, and verse structure, the singer must also sound the verse's provenance by citing past interpreters. Even in theatrical performance, there is an openness of form, an unfolding dialogue between the artists that for flamencos is essential. To perform rote shapes without this dimension of jointly making meaning is seen as ersatz, devoid of aesthetic value. My research focuses on a gesture that I call the pellizco, or pinch. The pellizco is a signal with a music and verse related function. It is fundamental to flamenco practice, Everyone, singers, dancers, musicians, and audience, does it at the same time. In flamenco, the signal foretells the ole, the coming end of the verse. And I'll just show you just one of these gestures, what I'm calling the pellizco. You'll see that Purili makes a gesture with his hand, kind of grabbing the end of the line, and you'll see that the guitar also punctuates this end of the line. Right, so that's the pellizco, for example. The title of my presentation today is Tracing Duende. I already told you what a pellizco is. Duende is the spirit that haunts us. I'm using the term duende in the sense of being haunted by the past. I'm viewing flamenco as embodying its past, and I am theorizing the circle of flamenco practice as a resonant sound chamber in which the past is immanent. My contention is that flamenco's gestural codes are so basic and so structuring of the unfolding improvisational flow that they are really a cultural embodiment. For many families, especially Andalusian Roma families, flamenco is a cultural practice, something they've been brought up with. The pellizco is a gesture of the flamenco circle, and this shared gesture not only communally embodies the verse, not only structures the improvisational flow, but the pellizco is also expressive of the shared dimension of emotion within the flamenco circle. The singer in this clip is Alonso Núñez Heredia El Purili. He is Andalusian Roma, a gitano or so-called gypsy from La Línea near the Atlantic port city of Cádiz. Purili is so young, he is 17 in this video. But with every inch of his performance, he venerates and references the flamenco legacy. He is already well known among flamencos, not for his raw talent, but for his polish and erudition. I will read in a very loose translation a bit of something written about him by noted flamenco expert José María Ruiz Fuentes. Alonso has been an artist since he was a child, and simply his manner of sitting in front of the audience makes them sit up and listen. He sings the opening warm-up with the depth of illustrious flamenco singer Antonio Meira, who lived from 1909 to 1983, with tones of Cádiz from another illustrious flamenco singer, Manolo Caracol, who was born in 1909 and died in 1973. And with a get up and go that brings to mind yet another illustrious flamenco singer, Juan Talega, who was born in 1891 and died in 1971. Then Purili sets off along the Plaza de las Flores in Cádiz, and he takes the hand of a fourth illustrious singer, María Amaya Heredia Landonda, who was born in 1831 and died in 1891, singing her famous Soleá verse. Escalerita de vidrio, por una sube la pena, por otra baja el alivio. Sorry, Alfonso. Which translates as glass staircase. On the one side, the pain goes up, and on the other, relief comes down. Ruiz Fuentes continues. Purili's maturity, ease, respect, and education are surprising in such a young singer. He is one of the leading artists of the young 21st century. Flamenco song runs through Purili's veins, Ruiz Fuente concludes, and thank God we have a singer who can preserve pure flamenco so that it is not lost. I write this because I heard him sing last night, and I was stunned by the greatness and power that he holds in his body. Medieval Iberian lyrics are strikingly similar to flamenco verses in incorporating a melodic and rhyming signal into their structure, a prompt for the audience to join in, today in saying ole, before in singing the estribillo or refrain after each verse. Because the audience sang the estribillo over and over again, it was memorized and thus readily transmitted as a portable fragment from song to song and from generation to generation. Indeed, the estribillo is central to flamenco today. I'm attempting to draw out correspondences in structural syntax between Andalusi and flamenco verses. My argument is that the codes regulating the complex interactions of rhyme, rhythm, melody, and strophic structure that govern flamenco's overarching aim of rematar el cante, to finish the verse, bear some striking resemblances to Andalusi verse. I am, of course, not arguing that flamenco is an exact reproduction of Andalusi lyric forms, but I am positing genealogical links which can be described. If I succeed in making this case, I hope to pose the further question, might the pellizco as the embodiment, the gestural expression of this syntax, itself be a trace of medieval Andalusi performance? And if this were so, what new insights would this expanded registry yield? Just have to move this out of the way. Sorry. In Andalusi lyric poetry, the first part of the verse, which some scholars call the mudanza, was variable in length and sung by a soloist. The second part of the verse, the penultimate part, sometimes called the vuelta, and which some flamencos call the cambio, contains changes in melody and also in rhyme, which cue the audience to come in and celebrate the ending of the verse, if you will, by singing the estribillo. This poem begins with the estribillo, which contains both the razón, or the moral of the story, and I'm citing Stephen Parkinson here, as well as information about the tune to which it should be sung, and the specifics of the rhythm and rhyme of the poem. As Emilio García Gómez writes, the hacha, the ending refrain, is like indicating the key in a piece of music or the rhythm to which it should be played. It contains all the information necessary to construct the rest of the poems, just as Jingle Bells does today. Wait a minute, go back. Oh, yes, I'm right. And just like the villancicos or Christmas carols of today, after every solo verse, the audience would join in singing the estribillo. And so, like the villancicos of today, they would tend to memorize the estribillo more easily than the verses.
desayuno que no puedo aguantar. Dame el desayuno que no puedo aguantar. Ande, 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 la mari morena. Ande, 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 que la noche es buena. Ande, 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 la mari morena. Ande, 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 que la noche es buena.
Rip Cohen writes, strophic form is an ancient human technology for transmitting, receiving, and retaining language, music, and other kinds of sociocultural competence. To serve those purposes, strophic design needs to be sturdy and efficient so that information is not lost. The strophic form of the estribillo can thus be seen as a sealed container of memory. And in line with the conceptualization of flamenco as communal practice, the knowledge which is imparted in the process of singing these songs, of memorizing the estribillo, of knowing when to come in with the refrain, is a joyful communal process of listening to the unfolding solo and anticipating what's coming next with excitement and pleasure. It is my contention that flamenco's basic codes of listening, remembering, and shaping the unfolding improvisation together, following along intently for the moment to say ole, are descended from and indeed retain the deep syntactic structures of the Andalusi lyric. I quoted Dorothy Clotel Clark above as saying that the Fejel was by far Alfonso's favorite strophe for the cantigas. And prominent scholars have traced transmission not only from the Andalusi lyrics such as the Fejel to the Alfonsine cantigas, but also from the cantigas to the 15th century villancicos, Christmas songs, which are still sung today. There are, of course, heated polemics surrounding the directions of influence between medieval Islamicate and Christian worlds, and authorities such as Federico Corriente, Otto Zwarchis, and Vicente Beltran read traces of the pathways of such cultural flows across languages, religions, and cultures in the specificity or lack thereof of the reproduction, the looseness or tightness of the poem's construction. We see that loosely, the villancico sung by the group Triana Pura y Pura in 1999 reflects the song structure of the Alfonsine Cantiga number 100. If you compare this Fejeles Cantiga with flamenco forms such as Bulerías, the party form, which Purilli is singing, it is clear that the flamenco forms are much more flexible and loose in their structure than the erudite lyrics of Al-Andalus. Purilli sings this verse telling a story about Triana, which is a famous flamenco and Roma neighborhood in Sevilla. In the second half of the verse, as he sings the word locos, or crazy, Purilli takes off one sleeve of his jacket. This is a familiar party gesture, demarcating a liminal space, and Purilli lets the phrase hang in the air, waiting a measure of 6 before coming in with the ending of the verse, cantando por bulería. So he says, están los gitanos locos, cantando por bulería. So we count in flamenco, we start counting on 12. So this would be 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I'll play it. He does it much better than me. While he started the verse as a narrator, now, even as his words describe the Gitanos logos in the third person, with this transgressive gesture, a gesture of dishevelment, contrary, I know you well know, to the courtly values of composure and symmetry and harmony. And by the way, the rhythm he is singing is the very bulerías that drives the Gitanos crazy. With this gesture of dishevelment, Purili is shifting corporeally into the first person. With his words, he is telling the story, but with his gesture, he shifts out of this presentational and formal posture of storytelling and into an intimate and first-person relation with the audience, becoming the disheveled, crazy Gitano rather than just describing him. Part of his embodied dishevelment is rhythmic, the improvisational play around the word locos. And of course, for flamencos in bulerías, adding extra measures is the whole name of the game. Adding this extra 6 to the word locos destabilizes the balance of the paired balance of measures. I want to be in America. And it has the effect of deferring and thus heightening the delicious and dramatic anticipation of the coming ole, or ending of the verse. As he takes off his sleeve and declines to finish the phrase, we can hear the audience respond. I'll just play this one more time for you. There's another dimension of the intimate relationship established with the audience, and I should say that this performance takes place in a peña, flamenco social club. As he does with his verses and melodies, with this gesture, Purili, who was born in 2000, cites older artists such as Miguel Funi, who was born in 1939, and closer to his own generation, Perico el Pañero, who was born in 1974, who also cites Funi. And of course, Anzonini, Paco Valdepeñas, a lot of these festeros do the same gesture. That is to say that as Purili is talking about the crazy Gitanos, he is simultaneously placing himself within this lineage, saying that he is one such crazy Gitano. And we as intimates in the conversation also participate in this small celebration of dishevelment, rebelliousness, and marginality, if you will. Then Purili tacks on an estribillo, or a refrain. He addresses the audience as mom. We all know that madre in Spanish means mother, and mama, it means mom. But Oma, and those of you who speak Arabic or Hebrew in the audience will find this interesting. Oma is the Andalusian country expression for mom. And not only does he address the audience as mom, as an Andalusian country mom, but he addresses the audience as Omaitita, which is little tender mom who I love very much. So he's entering into this very tender and personal relationship with the audience. And he's seeming to lament his drunken state, his helpless drunken state. But in the middle of the second line, which you see I have grayed out here, in exactly the same place as locos and borracherita, this syllable ita, he stops singing and instead finishes the line gesturally, firmly punctuating the last measures of the verse with foot stamps, giving a side eye to the audience and brushing an imaginary bit of dust off of his lapel, which is of course still hanging off his shoulder, and lifting an arm over his head in a triumphal and presentational flourish. With this, he clearly shows Not only that he was just kidding about being falling down drunk, but also that he feels the power and erudition of his performance of this verse, a citation of Santiago, a flamenco neighborhood in Jerez, the cradle of the bulerías form that he is singing. We hear the unison ole from the audience. They do not need him to finish singing the words because everyone knows this traditional verse. As Garcia Gomez writes in his discussion of the ending refrain as containing all the information needed, like jingle bells, to structure the rest of the poem, the jarcha simultaneously exists and evaporates. Sometimes it is only implicit, but even if the jarcha is missing, it leaves the reminder of its function. The simple allusion to the jarcha and no longer the jarcha itself fills in the ending of the poem. And I'll just play this passage for you one more time. To state the obvious, this little exegesis shows you how flamenco can signify on multiple and distinct levels for different audiences. For the emic audience, for the flamenco audience, as Jose Maria Ruiz Fuentes puts it, the greatness and grandeur that Purilli holds in his body is that he makes of the shared flamenco circle in which the audience participates in intimate relation a sound box, resonating with not only contemporary surroundings, but also receiving and pulsating outward across time, as I'm arguing here across vast expanses of time. I would venture a guess that none of the non-flamencos in this audience would pick up on any of this. And as I have argued in my first book, Sonidos Negros, on the Blackness of Flamenco, this is a very important way in which flamenco is aligned with the cultural production of the African diaspora. As Ralph Ellison says, it disagrees while seeming to agree, seeming to say, I am falling down drunk. It instead says, I am a master performing falling down drunkenness for you. It seems to comply with the inescapable tropes of racism, yet it resists. Seeming to say, I am passive and falling down, it instead says, I hold all the power of my lineage in my body. It establishes a powerful link with its ancestral heritage, which is invisible to the hegemon, hiding in plain sight. The flamenco pellizco functions as a corporeal, vocal, rhythmic, and as I explained in describing the pleasure associated with this gesture, emotional materialization of the ending of the verse. I am hypothesizing that this gesture is a trace from the medieval past. That is, I'm proposing that flamenco's embodiment of the structures of the medieval Iberian lyric records a heretofore unrecognized corporeal presence of this Afro-Islamicate medieval world. This is the methodological problem I'm engaging with, how to use dance knowledge to write history. The Romans, the Muslims, and the Europeans all accomplished territorial expansion through a strategy of cultural appropriation. And as difficult and problematic as this term is, I am gradually coming to the conclusion that we should still use it, although I will look forward to your thoughts on this. As Matthew Lohr, Carolyn MacDonald, and Daniel Padilla Peralta write in their book, Rome, Empire of Plunder, The Dynamics of Cultural Appropriation, strategies of cultural appropriation employ literary practices ranging from plagiarism to quotation, and material practices ranging from spoliation to commercial import. shifting in meaning and accreting varied and sometimes contradictory significations, an appropriated motif, and I am conceiving of the lyric structures and perhaps their gestural syntax as one such motif. Gradually, this becomes a semiotic bricolage that always carries with it vestiges of its earlier lives. For this reason, the authors continue, plotting the life history of appropriated texts and objects can represent in microcosm the study more broadly of cultural history or of culture itself. I think tracing such genealogical lines not only speaks to the immanence of the past in the body's memory, but also to the politics of cultural transmission and reproduction. Vernacular and elite spheres in medieval Iberia were distinguished in terms of religion. The interesting thing about this place and time is that the dominant religion flipped. From the 711 invasion of Islamic forces to the 1248 capture of Sevilla by Alfonso X's father, Fernando III El Santo, Islamicate culture is hegemonic. But after 1248, and especially after 1492, when Ferdinand and Isabel capture the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, Granada, this relation is reversed and Christian culture is hegemonic. As you know, the Spanish crown and church's regulation of limpieza de sangre or blood purity, as opposed to raza, race or religious difference carried in the blood, was transposed into the racist system of enslavement that shapes our world today. So the theoretical questions I am working on are about parity as contrafacta, a put down that provides the terms of modern racist representations of Blackness, yet nonetheless retains and transmits concrete elements of Islamicate culture, such as the deep structures of these Andalusi verses. As Garcia Gomez explains, the uptake at Andalusi courts of vernacular Christian or Mozarabic culture is incoherent and macaronic, transmission that Marisa Galvez describes as having an element of fingimiento, or pretending, transmission that Jack Halberstam might call a failure. I am particularly interested in looking at this from the perspective of flamenco artists and their ancestors, who are by definition marginalized and ostracized, and thus, to quote Jana Brown, players in the field of racialized fantasy, agnostic about the surface or the external form that they perform. On its surface, then, the parodic citations contained within the lyrics produced at both Muslim and Christian courts in medieval Iberia are reproductions and transmissions of racist stereotype, if you will. But somehow, as in Purilis Bulerias, this performance has an inside that contains an entire universe of meaning and memory. So I'm trying to figure out how to think about that. And in full confession to you flamencos out there, I am trying to recuperate at least this aspect of Mairenismo. This image is from Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I's Freidal Codex, the largest extant tournament book of the late Middle Ages. In this image of the mass capping the day's jousting tournaments, the male dancers wear black gauze on their faces, and we can easily imagine the sound that these wooden platform shoes might have made. As dancing master Thoino Arbeau's 1589 orchesography describes, the Moresca dancer, his face daubed with black and wearing leggings covered with little bells, performed tapping the feet or striking the heels together, or with foot and heel stamps intermixed. In Sonidos Negros, I relate flamenco's noisy footwork with this movement idea. The rhymes of the poetry performed at Andalusi courts agree either with Arabic or with Arabic and Romance. That is, legibility is important to the Arabic-speaking audience. But by the time we get to flamenco, or even to the 17th century theatricalizations of the criminal underworld, the jacaras, And by the way, the perra mora and the European saraband are also such representations of this world. We find that the performative surface is purposefully illegible. As medievalist Monica Otter says, it is cloaked in a paper-thin mask. In the Undercommons of 2013, Harney and Moten characterized this surface as fugitive. Think of Don Quixote, for example. Is he a noble knight on a quest, or a broken down old man in a broken down society? Or Unamunos del Otro of 1926. Who is the original and who is the copy? James Monroe has analyzed how, in the inverse of the Morisca pictured above, at the 12th century Andalusi court, an elite poet, Ibn Cuthman, couches a critique of his own caste in terms of an other, a bourgeois gentilhomme whose pretensions to noble sentiments, noble rhetoric, noble metaphors, and noble language fail hilariously. And this register of meaning is revealed through formal analysis of the poem's incoherent and pseudo-classical language. The irony of Ibn Cuthman's constitutive linguistic position, writes García Gómez, is not that he fails to master classical prosody, but that he uses colloquial language for reflexive and conscious, and we must assume aesthetic, if not stylistic, reasons. Introducing his divan, or collection of poems, Ibn Cuthman says as much, writing, "I made the thecheles close and distant, ordinary and strange, difficult and easy, concealed and obvious." We are in a world of irony, Monroe adds, where meanings are the opposite of what is stated. The objects of the poem's barbs, the Andalusi elite, is thus revealed in its very failure to reconcile the clashing constitutive linguistic positions of those whose encounter it depicts. Aside from the poet narrator, the poem's cast of characters includes dancing girls, one in drag, villagers, Arabs, a Jew, a camel, a wounded sheikh, and two white dogs performing a magic trick. It may be, in fact, that the ironic subtext of these syncretic, exquisitely detailed and difficult poems, perhaps even the critique implicit in their pastoralism, is inherent to the word thechel itself, which is, of course, the thechel is the strophic form employed in the Cantiga number 100. As Corriente explains, the Jarcha's unique linguistic register obviously served no other purpose than what is meant by the very word, to make an outing from the rigid literary and linguistic conventions of classical poetry and toward a lighter and lively style of folk poetry. This type of poetry is hazal, meaning facetiousness. The word hazali, Corriente adds, related to hazal, is synonymous with thechel for Ibn Cuthman. That is, one gloss for the word thechel or sachal is a facetious invocation of folk style. The medieval Iberian verse forms, whose characteristics I contend the flamenco estribillos retain, then themselves contained poetic quotation or contrafacta as a generator of form. And the lyric poetry of medieval Iberia, like its European descendants, as often as not, quotes the other parodically as a put-down. As Warchis alerts us in his extended discussion of code switching, the strophic forms which migrated between Christian and Muslim Iberian courts should be read neither as authentic Romance nor Arabic literary creations. The modifications and manipulations required to accommodate Romance language to classical Arabic prosody, García Gómez explains, lead to incoherence and a pseudo or false classical prosody. We see on the left an 11th century Egyptian depiction of a dancer, and on the right, a 15th century depiction of Morisca dancers parodying Moorishness. Not to belabor the comparison, but it bears noting that the image on the right employs something like the purposeful incoherence of the 12th century fechel of Ibn Kuthman. The postures of the Morisca dancers on the right seem to echo that of the dancer on the left, yet their jutting chins and elbows, their exaggerated genitalia, the cacophony of their tangled legs, the macaronic posture of pretending to sit on a broken stool, and the proximity of their dishevelment to that of the dogs, perros moros, eating filth off of the floor, embody the racist imaginary of the Moor while also seeming to reference it. How then should we look at parody as a form of contrafacta, which despite laying out the representational pathways of racism, serves nonetheless as a conduit in the reproduction and transmission of culture? I think one way in which we can track this is by looking at flamenco's multiple and often contradictory layers of signification, as I have just described, and the ways they are bound frictionally and critically to the complexities of Spanish history. In this vein, I am beginning to study queer performance theory and Halberstam's notion of failure within art forms like flamenco, which, despite being referentially opposed to their surface, still make listeners, when the duende is there, rend their garments. Included in his discussion of Morris dances, and specifically of Pyrrhic dances, Arbeau describes and illustrates the buffoon's dance. Combining military and dance imagery was not unusual in the 12th and 13th centuries, of course, and just as they are documented in the early 16th century Feudal Codex, we know that fencing and dance were both requisites of an aristocratic education well into the 17th century. Arbeau's Pyrrhic dances echo in the Spanish Fiestas de Moros y Cristianos, which reenact the epic battles between Muslim and Christian forces during this period, spectacles which continue in local festivals throughout Spain and its former colonies to this day. Let me clarify that I am not arguing that this Tuareg sword dance, which comes from the region of Africa that was bound to the Iberian Peninsula in religion, language, culture, and governance for 800 years, is definitely genealogically linked to the European Morisca. Talk about an exercise for your quads, right? However, following Maria Rosa Menocal, neither should we assume that it's not. Thank you so much.
Thanks ever so much, Meira, for a wonderful presentation and a really enticing glimpse into the book. I can't wait for it to come out. So I'm going to open the floor to any questions. Just as a reminder, if you do want to ask a question directly, then please either raise the little hand icon or feel free to drop a question in the chat and I'll get it out for you. So Judith, we have a question, by the way. Judith, over to you.
Hi, first of all, thanks so much, Meira. This is really a fascinating and beautifully presented presentation. So, I'm not an expert in flamenco, but I do know quite a lot about the Cantigas de Santa Maria. So I'm just kind of wondering here, there's a number of things. For one thing, a few obvious things that were written, not in any form of Spanish, but in Galaico-Portuguese, long before the Gitanos are thought to have arrived in what we call Spain now. But also, there's two things. One is that Manuel Pedro Ferreira, who is really, the musical scholar of the Cantigas, he writes that they were not widely sung or known. And, these are long, complex articles with a lot of evidence in them. But basically what he's saying is that people didn't sing them. So which was my last medieval illusion. I have to confess that when I read this article of Manuel Pedro, I wrote him right away and I said, Manuel Pedro, you've destroyed my last medieval illusion. All the cool things that I would say to the public. But what he says is that no, they were actually a very closed environment. The manuscripts are barely touched, and that probably they weren't sung. So the idea of these estribillos circulating, which I also, by the way, had assumed and talked about, probably doesn't work. On the other hand, many of the stories that are part of the cantigas, not the stories about Alfonso being sick and getting better and so on, but the folk tales circulated not as songs, but as folk tales that people knew. So it was a different kind of form. And then the other thing is that the structure with the estribillo and so on, it's not just the Cantigas de Santa Maria. So I'm not really sure that focusing on them, especially if they weren't widely known, is helpful, because, you know, the Zajal, of course, is that structure. And again, Manuel Pedro thinks that probably that was the strongest influence on the Cantigas, but it shows up right through French poetry, you know, Occitanian poetry, Troubadour, Trouvère, the Moishahat, and right into the Renaissance, which is when you do start having Gitanos present. So even, you know, Tres Morillas Me Enamoran is the same structure.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting, and I just am saying I need to say right off the bat that flamenco is my area of expertise and not medieval Iberian music or verse form or anything like that. I am working hard. I've been reading a lot, and so I know that I am making mistakes, and I am grateful to all of you experts in that field for correcting my mistakes and saving me from myself. I mean, you know, what I understand in terms of whether the cantigas were sung or not is that there is controversy around that, and I know that, for example, Stephen Parkinson's book, you know, most recently, I don't remember the date of it. It's certainly in the 21st century. He clearly says that these were sung, but, you know, I understand that there is controversy around that, and it's very hard to piece this stuff together, you know, and there is controversy surrounding all of this. I mean, what I also understand from the reading that I'm doing is that, as you say, Judith, the kind of specificity. So Zwarchi says, you know, like the fact that we see these refrains, and Artist Butterfield is a really important source to be reading about all of this, because she studies the circulation of the refrain, and she studies the circulation between elite and vernacular spheres, which I think is a really important thing to be thinking about as we're, you know, a dimension to be thinking about as we're looking at all of this. But basically, and Beltran says this, he has an incredible article, which took me about 6 months to read, on the Tejeles y Danzas. It really literally took me 6 months to try to, I still don't completely understand it, but you know, what is refrain or whatever it is, right? But what a lot of these scholars like Beltran, like Zwarchi say is that the fact that in, for example, some of the French traditions, the structure is not so completely replicated as it is, you know, within the Andalusi tradition, for example, is an indication that, you know, well, perhaps the influence comes from this direction or comes from that direction. I mean, I think that, you know, the controversies themselves give us some hints about, you know, where these cultural flows are going. And I guess the final thing that I will say, you know, and thank you, Judith, and I hope that we'll continue this conversation. I really do. But, you know, the other thing about this flipping of the religions that I think is important is that, you know, in Al-Andalus, in Islamic Al-Andalus, it's the Muslim culture which is hegemonic and the Christian culture which is, you know, not hegemonic, let's just say. And then it switches. And so what happens now, all of a sudden, you know, we have these Christian courts emulating Andalusi forms and structures, and they're using them to put down the Moros, you know, which were the source of those structures in the first place. So I think that kind of, you know, so what happens is that what was elite culture in Al-Andalus is now, you know, subaltern culture, and that is where the Gitanos come in, because they're, you know, the Gitanos and enslaved Africans and freed Africans and, moriscos, and, everybody was kind of in this, undercommons, if you will. And it's the hegemonic Christian culture, which is representing them in some way that is meant to be a put down. But I'm arguing it's also kind of retaining that and transmitting that forward. So just to finish, the villancicos are looser than, the cantigas, and the flamenco verses are looser than the villancicos. And for example, an expert like Faustino Núñez says that what I'm calling estribillos, and I did grow up calling these estribillos in flamenco, like I've been dancing flamenco since I was 15 years old, and I always called them estribillos, but a lot of people call them coletillas. And somebody like Faustino Núñez says, no, the coletilla is not the estribillo, because the estribillo is this thing that's sung the same way at the same time. And what I'm arguing is that the flamenco, what we call coletilla, which is not always the same melody, it's not always the same verse, the same words, but it is the same syntactic structure. It works syntactically in the same way. So that's the argument that I'm making. But yes, you're right. It's loose, and it's 1,000 years, so it makes sense that it would be loose.
Right. I'm just saying that the refrain is obvious. I just don't think the cantigas are the best example to use. I think, that other forms are more relevant to the discussion. And just by the way, when I last was together with Stephen Parkinson and Manuel Pedro, we were teaching a cantigas course actually in Madrid. Stephen was just as sad as I to read that article of Manuel Pedro's.
Oh boy, okay. Well, I stand corrected. Thank you.
Thank you, Judy, for the question. So we've got lots of hands and a question in the chat. So Samuel first, and then we'll move to Constance Hill in the chat.
Oh, thank you so very much. Oh, Meira, brilliant as usual, and you've launched me on a number of ideas as I really rethink this. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you so much. I have just more of a reaction than a question, and that is, and again, forgive my terror. As you know, I'm an outsider coming to flamenco culture and writing. And so also my Spanish is terrible. But how do you pronounce the bedisco or the gesture? I want to speak to that. How do you pronounce that?
Pellizco with a P.
Pellizco. Pellizco. Okay, that is really fascinating for me. If I can just riff on it, I feel like it's a gesture of the body, but it's also a device of sonification, in that, it sonifies really the gesture, which is really interesting, that makes one hear the instrumentation of the music. So I see it as, and I'm going to riff on this as I go and apply it to my writing, a device of sonification. And it also, I think, as I see it again in this young man who sang, it's also, it imparts, when it comes, it also imparts, I think, an emotional device in the grammar of its phrasing. And in that, it really deepens, or at least highlights, the essence of duende in it. So it also allows the body or the dancer to become an instrument in the ensemble. Of course, as a tap historian, I'm thinking about the way that tap dance operates as an instrument in the ensemble. And so also, I'm looking at that gesture of the jacket unfolding from the young man's shoulder. And I'm looking at that also as a sort of a visual elongation of the musical line, which is like really, really interesting for me, because you're, again, hearing the music in a different way, as well as really making the grammar. So I'm thinking about how that applies like to the work that I'm doing. I'm thinking, and I'm inviting anyone who can really riff with me on that, but I'm thinking like, where do I see that again? Like in blues dancing, and Brenda is online. I mean, could it be, for me in blues dancing, could it be, the displacement of the hip, which is in a way of again, listening on a deeper level to the music. And I'm thinking in Rebetica, which I'm writing about, Zepetico dancing, that it also, the gesture, when it comes, also really brings to me this idea of where the rhythmic line is. I mean, it really, in Zepetico dancing, and when I'm thinking of the way that I see that dancing, that I'm really reminded of that rhythmic structure of 9/8, right? Which I would not hear about again. So I'm going to apply this, wondering if anyone else sees it or hears it in any of the other dance forms. Thank you.
Did you want to respond to that, Meira?
Yeah, no, just to say that I completely agree with you, Constance. I mean, I really, that's the whole point, is that, flamenco music, it has an embodied dimension, and it's right there, for all to see and feel. It's right there. We all know it's there, but it's sort of, it's something that we don't stop to think about, I guess. We sort of, I don't know, like, I feel like for myself, it took me a long time to just even look at that somehow. Like I was sort of trying to get the step right, or try to, do this or that, correctly. And it sort of took me a while to kind of, it wasn't until I started teaching bulerías improvisation, actually, that I started to become aware of these kind of deeper, structures. So yeah, completely. I completely agree. Yeah.
Thank you. And thank you, Constance, for the question. Samuel, over to you.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, well, hola, Meira. It's
Hola, muchas gracias por venir.
Really great to hear your paper. So my question is, coming back to your point about gesture in flamenco embodying history, which I think is a very provocative and a very interesting point. So my question has to do you think we could, following from the many examples that you've given and the fact that you've referred several times to Spanish history as being complex, or history just being complex in general, can we think of that past not as a stable past, but as a past that gets, negotiated, reenacted in multiple forms through performance? Can we think, so coming back also to the examples that you've given of, García Gómez, who, had an agenda. You've mentioned the question of influence and manipulation, and he did have an agenda, as did Julián Rivera with his study of the cantigas and everyone. So I'm trying to think of gesture in flamenco here, not as being a gesture that, embodies an entire history or embodies a sort of specific memory of the past, but as being part of that condensation where, there's different interventions in the past, where you can consider García Gómez, but you can also include Rivera and other people. And I'm not trying to suggest here that gesture in flamenco is a form of manipulation, but I'm trying to see specific gestures in specific moments by specific people as forming part of that conversation, so that we can look at this dialogue as not just happening, in written form and then separately through gesture in flamenco, but as, can we think of a richer texture and a richer, tapestry here? And so I'd just like to know your thoughts about this.
Yeah, I mean, thank you. And I just think so much about the fact that, our interpretation, our reading of history is colored by the world that we live in, in a given moment. So, but it's the best we can do, I suppose. We can't really get outside of the moment that we live in. The thing that I think about in terms of gesture is, flamenco, and actually this is true of a lot of other Africanist forms as well, is it's pantomimic. So it's, like, for example, Ana is here, in the jacaras of the 17th century, right? They're going to be, these are going to be actresses that are going to be on stage. They're going to be telling a story, and they're going to be telling a story which is only through suggestion, because they couldn't tell it oh, and I put the cup onto the table over there, and oh, what did I think? I just broke it, right? They can't tell it in that kind of a literal gestural way, but it's all through kind of insinuation and indication and Elizabeth Le Guin is fantastic on all of this. But, you know, in flamenco, we have all of this kind of, you know, pantomime and kind of impersonation of the other. Like we have that all the time. Like there's this one guy, you know, when we get to the ending, what I call the mutis in your, you know, if you're in Bulerías and you're leaving, you know, often you'll do like a gesture. You like take an apple and put it in your, you know, put it in your apron, or you'll, you know, they're like pantomimic gestures that you will do. And I interpret those, I see those kinds of, that layer, if you will, I see that as a sort of a layer of gesture. And when I was looking at Purili's, you know, gesture of taking off the jacket, which people know, you know, flamencos know that gesture. What I was really trying to describe is the kind of genealogy of gesture, you know, so just as Purili can cite a song, he's also citing a corporeal gesture. But the pellizco, what I'm calling the pellizco, and by the way, it's, you know, all of this terminology is very loosey-goosey, and, you know, flamencos call the pellizco basically any place in the verse that you know, kind of accent it or close it or punctuate it. And I'm kind of identifying it with what I'm thinking of as the vuelta, which is this kind of penultimate place that leads to the ending of the verse. You know, to me, that kind of body language is, I think it's older. I just think it's way older because it's so fundamental, and it's done always. Like Constance and I were talking about, why did I pick Purili, right? You know, as an example of this. For no particular reason, I could put any flamenco video on and you'll see the pellizco everywhere. You know, it's everywhere. So to me, it's like one thing to sort of say, you know, oh, you know, the amolador or whatever it is, right? And it's another thing to do this kind of thing, which, as you say, Constance, it's like, it's the embodiment of the music. It's a different layer to me. I conceive of it as a different layer. Do I have any proof of that? No, I do not. But it is, you know, I will say that over the time I've been dancing flamenco, I've seen changes in the form, plenty of changes in the form. And that is a layer that never changes. So like the syntax never changes, the rhythm doesn't change. And this kind of gestural layer, or, you know, embodiment of the music, if you will. I was almost kind of thinking about not using the word dance. Like I've been kind of going back and forth about using the word dance as opposed to just embodiment, because of that, because it's just, that's something that in my lifetime, and, you know, it's a drop in the bucket, but it's at the same time a long time in flamenco history, I suppose. It doesn't change. That's my thought. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you ever so much. And thank you, Selma, for the question. Vanessa, over to you.
Hi, thank you. So I have a couple of questions. I'll give you the quicker one probably first, and then the longer one. My short question is, I was struck actually by the fact that Jews aren't present in your presentation. So there are all these different populations in Iberia at this time, and the Jews are also some of the ones that suffered this kind of radical shift at that certain time. So I just wanted you to speak to that. But the other thing that I'm also interested in is this this idea of the refrain as a structural unit of transmission that's, you know, without the content being necessarily what's being transmitted, but actually the syntax or the structure, as almost like a form that has three-dimensional shape, and that then maybe actually goes into the body in a different way. So I'd love to hear more about that also. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, no, I know. I mean, you know, I don't mention the Jews, and I should mention the Jews because I'm Jewish, but, you know, the Jews, I mean, the fact is that I'm using the word Islamicate in this kind of more generalized way to talk about that cultural world. And I don't know enough. I mean, I need to learn more. I mean, I know about, Halevi's, famous contrafacta contest, and and I know about, of course, the discovery of the Kharchas, by Stern. So, I know about those connections, but I need to know more. And so, I would be really grateful to you if you would, because I understand that this is your field of expertise, and I would just love it if you'd like shoot me stuff to read. I need to read more. It's hard because, I don't think there's that much out there. I mean, I haven't encountered that much, so I would love to read more and know more. And and it's funny because I actually I have a part of my family is very, very observant, very frum, and so I had a whole conversation with my brother-in-law about cantillation and the gestures that we do when we're reading, and I just I think that's fascinating, and I don't know enough about it. And I guess I'll say the other thing, I'll just reveal that I'm really interested in if I can draw the body back to this period of time, and in a conditional way, as Samuel says, it's always a contested and fluid history. But I'm really interested in the development of spirituality in this period of time in Al-Andalus, and I'm interested in the voice in particular, Constance, about the connection with the divine, the way that the voice, Amnon Shaloa says this very beautifully, about how the voice sets up, a connection with the divine in some sort of specific ways. And I know nothing about this, but I want to study it, and I'm interested in it. And I really do believe that flamenco, as I'm talking about these kind of layers of flamenco signification, I really do believe that flamenco holds an insight which is true and which is, I think, sacred in the sense that it holds on to one's ancestry and one's past. So, there's that. And that's, I can't say much about it, but I would love to talk with you more about it too, for sure. And in terms of the gesture, it's, in flamenco verses, I mean, this is just how flamenco verses go. And some of you guys that are here have actually studied with me, right? And I always talk about the flamenco verses you can think of it as having 3 lines. And the first line, even if it's 2 lines, it can be treated as 1 line. It's the part that's much more open. You're going to kind of stay off of it as a dancer. You're not going to trample on it, because you want the singer to be able to have the space to develop however they want that part. And then when you get to the second 2 lines, basically what I call the BC, what I'm calling sort of ish the vuelta and the estribillo, or the vuelta and the whatever, the remate, it's all very kind of fluid. But there's a point where in this, what I'm calling the pellizco, or this kind of second line, which is, I'm thinking of the BC lines as the refrain, basically, as the estribillo or the coletilla. And so there's a point in that second line before we get down to the home tone, where we're going to introduce this kind of indication that it's coming, right? But maybe we're going to tease the audience a little bit, or maybe we're going to play a little bit. What I always say is like, if you're doing a llamada and how many times do you do that? Well, as many times as you want, right? And it's only when you decide, okay, I'm going to throw the ball up in the air. I'm going to throw the ball up in the air my way as many times as I want. And then there's a moment when I'm going to catch it and I'm going to hand it off to the next person. So that would be like the ending, or the remate. So I'm just interested. I think that the communication that happens in this penultimate part, as you say, this kind of shape, this kind of structure, is really open. It's not, specific as these cantigas would have been, for example, right? It's much more open. And for example, in the Africanist forms, the clave forms that are kind of all over the diaspora, they always have this symmetry of, I want to be in America. The yin and the yang always have to be there. But in flamenco, somehow we have this kind of value of dishevelment, I would call it perhaps, or confusion or bulla, the things that I talk about in sonidos, where you take away that half, the second half. No, I'm not going to give you that second half yet. And you kind of play around and you keep playing and keep playing and keep playing. And that's the fun. I mean, that's the joy. And it is something that's shared by the whole flamenco circle. So, I could put any video on and show you this in action, because it's just what happens in the flamenco circle. So the structuring, this kind of moment of play that I'm kind of identifying with the pellizco, right? This kind of pulling it up, like the pellizco goes up in the air, right? So the pellizco goes up and up and up. No, I'm not coming down yet. And then at some point I'm going to go down, right? So that's the electric shock that passes through the flamenco circle, right? You saw the guitarist and you saw the singer all, it's at 1 second, and the audience, everybody is doing that gesture when everybody is doing that pellizco together. So it's something that's really, I just think that these are kind of really deep structures somehow. I don't know if that answers your question, but I really do hope that we can talk some more.
It's a longer conversation.
So Carlos, you've had your hand up for a long time, so over to you.
Thanks very much. Thank you so much, Meira, for such a wonderful presentation. It's all been very, very interesting. Following on a little bit from your earlier, what you just said about the pellizco, I think your presentation has really revealed this rich, these textures, all these layers of meaning. So I was just curious to hear more about your thinking about rhythm in flamenco, perhaps not only the concept of pellizco, but also the jaleos, the interaction between artists and audiences, the palmas as well, and all the different gestures and layers of meaning that they involve. The work that you're currently doing, are you also going to incorporate analysis of those kinds of rhythmical aspects of flamenco? And I was also wondering, how do you think that your work and the genealogies that you're tracing might inform pedagogies of flamenco? Because precisely those pellizcos and the gestures, the palmas, the jaleos, might be one of those often overlooked aspects in teaching, but they are obviously crucial for the emergence of meaning and all these rich layers of meaning, right? So just curious to hear your thoughts on that.
That's interesting. Yeah, just to take your second question first, what I'm noticing is that there, in universities in the United States, there are all kinds of positions available for people teaching Africanist diasporic forms, where there weren't before. Before it was only ballet and modern dance. And so, I think people are realizing, I think that the center is moving, I would say. I think the center is moving. And, what I'm always struck by is that, like, in the flamenco world, let's just say, we all know what the genealogy is, right? We all know, you know who your teacher was, you know who your teacher's teacher was, you know what that lineage is, because that's the communal knowledge that we hold together, and yet at the same time, that's not, it's not so widely known. And I will say that I'm working on a book called Flamenco History, Performance, and Culture, and I'm trying to tease out these, I'm trying to put these down on the paper. Of course, someone will, and as I said, about Meira, like if you just look at Mundo y Formas, like that's got all you need to know, I think, right there. Like, I just think that's an amazing book. Anyway, so in terms of pedagogy, I think it's helpful, and I don't want to say this in an absolute way, but I think it's helpful for practitioners to teach and to share, and for teaching to be done in a practice-based way. I think that's just always very, very helpful. And to your first question, Carlos, and Judith, one of the things, so in terms of rhythm, in terms of flamenco rhythm, I do believe that, when I call flamenco an Africanist form, I do believe that a lot of the, or at least some of the rhythm that we do is really, West African that comes back to us from the Americas, I would say. I just think there's a lot of influence there. And I'm very curious about rhythm, obviously, because I'm a flamenco person and I love rhythm, and the one thing that I keep thinking about is that, and this is something that I don't understand, Judith, and that I've been trying to understand, but there's something about, syllabification or something like that I don't understand at all. But what I do know is that even in the very rhythmic flamenco forms like bulerías, or you could think of verdiales, for example, which is even older, right? That even though it has this very steady rhythm, this very, I think about the rhythm as being this kind of, establishment of space. Like it establishes a space where, I always tell the story about, being in the tablao, and like, if you just wobble a little bit, it like sets the whole thing off, it's like, it ruins everything, and, so there's something about this space, which is just full and alive and not crowded and not nervous and not, crunched up, right? Which is flamenco rhythm. And on the top of that, though, the singer is not like the singer. If the palmas are like, up and down in an equal, metronymic way, the song goes over the top of that, and the song needs to go over the top of that, even in forms that are, rhythmic. So I guess that's the thing, and I'm frankly wondering whether that's also something that is something from the Andalusi repertoire. I don't know, but I am struck by the way. I mean, you can't write out a flamenco song rhythmically. Like you can't write out a flamenco line rhythmically because there's just, or at least, I'm not a musicologist. I'm sure a musicologist can, but like what's happening rhythmically is just so complicated, it seems to me. So yeah, I don't know. I would love to continue this conversation. I'm just so excited about meeting all of you that are working in this, and yeah, it's just amazing. So let's keep talking about that. I would love to.
Thanks ever so much, Meira. We are up to time. I know, Judith, you have your hand up. I don't know if you have a very quick comment that you wanted to come back at.
No, I'm sorry, I already said it in the chat. I just wanted to make a comment about the history of Jewish music in Spain and what we know about it. But I wrote it in the chat, so if it's saved.
Great.
Basically, we don't know anything about Jewish music in the Middle Ages, just that they were there. But and we don't know that those musicians, sorry, the Jewish and Muslim musicians that we see in the miniatures, people use that to talk about convivencia and how they all got along. But actually, every single cantiga that mentions a Jew or a Muslim, they're only good if they're dead and or convert to Christianity. So,
right.
We get a lot of these very idealistic comments coming from these things, but unless we go into them in detail, there, I think we have to be careful about the comments that we make.
And that's just my point about, parody as being a form of contrafacta. I just think that that's just a really interesting thing where, it's this put down, and yet it's also reproducing elements of the real culture, which, if they're still here, it must be for some reason, right? They must, they pass through that stage, if you will, it seems to me.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Judith. And thank you, Meira, ever so much for this wonderful presentation. It's really instigated some great discussion. I do have questions. I'm going to send them via email, if that's all right. And maybe we can find another time to continue the conversation. Thanks ever so much to all of you for coming. I would just like to flag up our next event for the series, which is on the 26th of November, so next Friday, which will be at 6 o'clock GMT. We've got a talk and a concert from our PhD student, Eric Petzold, his project Moroccan Music and Jazz with Jalt Daka Afro-Med, which will be live streamed from Germany. So I'm just going to put in a link to the website with the upcoming events. So if you are available, then do please come along, register. All of our events are free and all will be held online. So yes, thank you ever so much. Thank you again, Professor Goldberg.
Thank you all for coming. Thank you so much for coming, everybody. I really appreciate it. Let's follow up. Please reach out to me. You know what I should do is, can I put my email, or they can get there by email from you? Yeah, you know, so just shoot me an email. Come to me. Come and say hello to me, and let's continue the conversation. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody.